And today we get to look at the jolly fat man, Santa Claus. Uh, no, I wasn't talking about anybody here. Thank you, Steve. Uh, um, what we're going to do in this series is look at some of the icons of Christmas and where they came from. One of the things that's important to understand is a whole lot of stuff we just assume has always been there hasn't. And we are shaped by culture. So we want to see if we can track how we got to Santa Claus, but actually who is the man behind the myth and what can we learn from his life? Because there actually was a Saint Nicholas. He was born in around 270 AD. Now we've got a map where he turned up from. And so you'll see this is, to give you some sort of bearings, Myra is where he was the bishop of. And I think we've got the next map that will just help you see. So he was born in Patara. He was the bishop of Myra. You can see up the top there is Nicaea. He was part of the Council of Nicaea. And Constantinople was kind of the center of, named after Constantine. It was a major center at the time. So that just gives you some bearings. And as we said, born in 270, died in 343 AD. Does anyone know much about ancient history and know roughly what kinds of things were happening between 270 and 340? There was a pretty major thing that happened for the Christian church around 300 AD. Does anyone know what that was? That's exactly right. Emperor Constantine becomes a Christian. So when Nicholas was born and up to his early 20s, he was being faithful to Jesus in a world where it was illegal to be faithful to Jesus. And then he lives through this revolution where the political establishment align themselves with Jesus. And so he then gets to be part of the wrestles about what is the nature of God and the Nicene Creed, which is the one creed that all Christians agree on, although the Western Church edits it a little later on, and there's still some discussions about the edits. But the Nicene Creed is something that the Christian church around the world agree on. He was part of that. We've got a picture of an early photo of St. Nick. They didn't have the same Polaroid technology we have. This is St. Nicholas, one of the earliest pictures we have of him. And there are three stories that have been passed down through history about St. Nicholas that many historians think are based in fact. There are other stories that they think are not based in fact, but I want to just focus on these three stories and the values by which Nicholas lived his life, because just to say, immediately after his death, people were celebrating him and having holidays in his name because his impact was that significant. So there was something about the way he lived his life, and these three stories tell us a little bit about how he lived his life and also contrast with our picture of Santa Claus. The first story I come back to, we've just been to Canberra to advocate on behalf of the people of Burma, and one of the guiding verses of that was Proverbs 31:8. Speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. Ensure justice for those being crushed. Yes, speak up for the poor and helpless and see they get justice. That's Proverbs 31:8. And I'm fairly sure Nicholas took that to heart and that shaped him. So that proverb, we don't know what he was thinking when he heard that three poor men were taken from their homes because a rich lord didn't like them and he had bribed the executioner to kill them. It's interesting. Interesting. We don't know exactly what year this was, but my guess is it is after Constantine has had his turnaround. But Nicholas hears that, and he doesn't immediately hold a prayer meeting. He doesn't write letters. The first thing he does is run. He runs from where he is to because executions happened in the town square, and he ran to the town square. And history says, as the executioner was raising the sword to kill the first man, Nicholas jumps in and grabs his arm and says, "Stop. In the name of God, stop." He puts himself in danger to prevent the injustice, and he stands up and says, "You know why these people are here? It's because this gentleman was paid off. He accepted a bribe. These people have done nothing wrong." And he stands up and he says this to the town square, which is pretty remarkable thing to do in a world where there isn't you don't have any constitutional rights. You are just trusting the goodwill of the people who run the army and who lead the town. And so he is risking his life. But because he stands up and speaks truth for these men, the town go, "Hang on." And immediately the executioner knows it's not in his best interest to execute these men. And the person who accepted the bribe and the person who gave the bribe are held to account. And history remembers Nicholas as someone who, as the proverb says, speaks up for those who can't speak for themselves. And I love that the real Santa Claus calls us to not focus on ourselves, but to look for injustice and speak up against injustice. I love the next story, and again, one of the temptations is to think of our faith as a private thing. There is a Baptists really have impacted the world and gave the world the idea of the separation of church and state. But when we gave the world that, it was about keeping the government out of the church, not keeping the church out of the government. One of the dangers of that is we can think we don't have a role in caring about what's happening in the community. We can think our task is just to sing songs and pray, but rather than take leadership in the community. Well, Myra hit a famine, and I think Nicholas was challenged, at least would have known Jeremiah 29:7, the call to work for the peace and prosperity of the city to where I'm sending you. Pray to the Lord for it, for its welfare will determine your welfare. I think that it's not okay for us to sit back and just think Hobart has its issues. We actually have to care about Hobart's issues, and we actually meant to work for the peace and prosperity of Hobart. That's what Nicholas understood, and that's why, as he saw people starving, he didn't say, "We'll just hold a prayer meeting." He saw a flotilla. Is that another word for ships? A bunch of ships coming into the harbour on their way to Constantinople with grain for the people of Constantinople. The ships were owned, and the stock in the ships were owned by Constantine. And Nicholas approaches the sailors on behalf of the city. He didn't wait around for the leader of the army or the rich people to do it. He stepped in and spoke to the sailors and said, "Look, our people are starving. We need some of that grain you've got on those ships." And we have recorded this transaction where the sailors said, "Look, if we do that, we're dead. If we give you what is owned by the emperor, we will die. We can't. And the sentence that is passed down through history is Nicholas says to them, trust that God will not let you suffer for doing what is right. Ultimately, there is an eternal story, and you can trust that God will not let you suffer for doing right. Now, many of us can quickly think of times where people have suffered for doing what is right, but ultimately, there is an eternal story, and it is true that it's always right to do what's right. And so my guess is those sailors were terrified as they released some of that grain. That grain made all the difference. The town, it's recorded, had all the food they needed for the next 2 years. And Nicholas demonstrated he wasn't just leading the church, he cared for and was leading the whole city. And the final story, is the most famous Nicholas story, and you may have heard it before. I think we've even got a picture of it. I'm not sure if we do. Yeah, there it is. You see, there's Nicholas. He didn't actually have a halo, and this is an old thing but this is a picture of him dropping bags of gold through a window. And again, for us, hard to imagine. Nicholas was, as best we can tell, he was not a wealthy man, but the social security system didn't exist in those days. There was a whole other system. And what had to happen, if you wanted your daughter to get married, you had to pay someone to take her off your hands. They call that a dowry. If the parents were not wealthy enough to pay a dowry, the only options available to the women were slavery or prostitution. They were the only options available to them. And we're not sure why this was a single dad. We don't know, but history says it was a single dad, and he was a poor dad, and he had 3 daughters. And the first daughter wanted to get married, and the father had to say, sorry, love, I'd love to, but I actually I can't afford it. And so they go to sleep, and then the next morning they wake up and there is a little purse with gold coins in it, enough for the dowry for the first daughter. Don't know how the other daughters felt about that as they saw that, but the older sister was able to get married. And then not long after, the next daughter was saying, it was nice for the older sister to get married. What about me? And again, the father had to say, sorry, I don't have the money. And again, the next morning, a purse appears in the house with gold coins in it. The father begins to get suspicious, saying, these purses don't just appear. And so as it's time for the third daughter to get married, he actually, and he makes it known publicly, he stays up all night and he catches Nicholas in the act. And Nicholas, history records that Nicholas pleads with him, don't tell anybody about this. Obviously, the fact that history records it means it wasn't so successful. But it's interesting, in the context of Christmas, the real Santa Claus was shaped by a real spirit of generosity. And there's a passage in Matthew 6:3-4, which we talked about when we did the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you'll have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, don't announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honoured by others. Truly, I tell you, they've received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. I love, one of the things I know, one of the privileges of being a pastor, is you can glimpse some of this stuff happening just even in our church family. I love that Linda was recognised for her gift of her time in our golden moments. There's always people doing stuff that nobody sees, because that's what the church is when it's at its best. It's full of people who are trying to take this stuff seriously, trying to be generous, not to get stuff out of it, but in order just to be generous. It's also full of people who are seeing the city and caring about what's actually happening in the city. And it's also full of people who are standing up for justice. So, how did we get from this man who stands up for justice, leads his city, and gives in private? How do we get from that to the jolly red man in the fat suit? Well, that's what I want to look at just briefly. Because there was one of the things, as I've already said, almost immediately, people, as soon as St. Nicholas, obviously just in passing, for those of us who are Protestants and not Catholics, we believe everybody is a saint in the Protestant church. But because the early church would talk about saints as kind of being special people you could look up to, that's why we still use the language of St. Nicholas, because it's part of the church tradition that happened well before the Reformation. So, how did we get there? Well, immediately, almost. And we're not exactly sure why it was December 6th, but on December 6th, the church started remembering St. Nicholas, and on those days, they would give gifts to each other. But primarily, they would give gifts to the poor, to people who needed things. And that was kind of, for about 1,500 years, that was what St. Nicholas's Day was all about. It was a day of generosity, about sacrificial giving. But then we have Martin Luther and the Reformation, and he's really not keen on saints. He really wasn't keen on saints. So for most of the Protestant church, they stopped recognising saints and saints' days. But I don't know if you notice this, Dutch people can be a bit stubborn. I'm not at all thinking about my mother-in-law, but Dutch people can be a bit stubborn. And the Dutch loved what they called Sinterklaas Day, Sinterklaas, and they continued to recognise that holiday, December 6th, as Sinterklaas Day, and they brought that with them to America. And so America picks up the story, and it's really America that gives us Santa Claus. To start with, although I'm not actually sure whether this was American or English, the next development in the story of Santa Claus comes from, who remembers this, A Night Before Christmas? It was a night before Christmas, and all through the house. Yep, a few people remember it, obviously. That poem story was written in 1823, and it was written by someone called Clement Clarke. Before 1823, St. Nicholas was remembered as a bishop. He was still called Sinterklaas by the Dutch people, but that poem changed it, and as part of that, Santa became a small elf-like, merry and magical kind of figure. He arrives on Christmas Eve instead of December 6th. He rides a sleigh pulled by reindeer. He enters through chimneys. He gives toys, he doesn't give gifts to charity. And he laughs, and he's got a gut like a bowl full of jelly, apparently. And so this poem takes Santa out of the church calendar and away from St. Nicholas's life, and places him into like a whimsical fairy tale. This is still not the Santa we recognise now. The earliest picture we have recorded of Santa Claus comes from this wood carving that is from 1848. And you can see Santa Claus looks a bit more like a Cossack. He's pretty skinny. He's going down chimneys, but this was what the author of that picture had in mind. This is not from the original book, but it's from a couple of decades later. This is the first recorded picture we have of Santa Claus. Then in 1843, we don't get a direct pictures of Santa Claus or a direct reference to Santa Claus, but we do get this mystique building up around Christmas with Dickens' A Christmas Carol, and then we get this. A fellow called Thomas Nast creates this picture you see in front of you now, and he really creates the modern Santa. He does this for a magazine or a newspaper called Harper's Weekly Bazaar. He drew Santa as a jolly, round and bearded, red-suited man. He added the North Pole, and he added the naughty or nice list. And he kind of adds this Santa we recognise today. Joe, I don't know if there's also a newspaper article there, I think. So this is the colour version of it. And yeah, this is the front page from the Civil War. And this is this picture of Santa Claus giving stuff out to the troops in the 1850s. But we don't really get Santa we recognise today quite yet. That has to happen for the post-war period. And from 1931 onwards, the Santa Claus we love and recognise comes because they were trying to market Coca-Cola. And there is an advertising executive, Haddon Sandblom, paints Santa for the Christmas advertising, and he becomes this warm, grandfatherly figure with a bright red suit. And the reason this takes off is still today, one of the remarkable things of Coca-Cola is it's one of the only things you can find almost in every country on earth. And I've been to the far outback of West Africa, and there's still ads for Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola's advertising reach was remarkable, and this becomes their advertising Christmas gimmick. And still today, Coca-Cola spend a massive portion of their advertising budget at Christmas time because Coca-Cola want to own the colours red and white and want to own Christmas. And so this is how we get what we call Santa Claus. And it's interesting how culture changes. I've even noticed these days, if you go to a Christmas shop, there are as many Grinches as there are Santa Claus, which is a bit depressing. And can you see how culture takes a truth and shapes it and makes it less and less scary and makes it more and more suitable for the culture? And then that shapes us. A real disciple in 270 AD became a bishop celebrated for his generosity for the first 1,500 years of the church's life. Then he becomes, in the 1600s, a Dutch tradition. Then he becomes a magical elf in 1823. He becomes a cultural Christmas symbol around 1843. And he becomes a red-suited icon in the 1860s. And then finally he becomes a global brand in 1931. So this is where Santa comes from. And can you see how he's different from the real Saint Nick? Our culture kind of kept the sense of joy around Santa Claus, but we lost the justice. Nicholas confronted corruption. Santa never challenges anybody. We kept the giving, but we lost the generosity of giving to people beyond our family circles in some ways. Nicholas gave quietly and sacrificially. Santa is just a symbol of consumerism. We kind of kept the magic associated with Nicholas, the sense of special things, but we lost the meaning. Nicholas loved because he followed Jesus. The cultural symbol of Santa doesn't ask a lot of you. The source of Nicholas's love was his love for Jesus. The source of Santa's actions these days are the whimsical ideas of an advertising executive. The Santa story reinforces a materialist and selfish culture. The true story of St. Nicholas calls us to the true revolutionary nature of what Christmas is actually about. One of the very first promises we have of Christmas, is a promise that the injustices of the world would be corrected by the Christmas story. Isaiah 9:6-7 says, "For to us a child is born, unto us a child is given. The government will rest on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His government and its peace will never end. He will rule with fairness and justice from the throne of his ancestor David for all eternity. The passionate commitment of the Lord of heaven's armies is going to make this happen." For a people waiting in darkness, the baby born in Bethlehem was not a technique to sell Coca-Cola. He was a promise of a different system of justice where the poor would be cared for, where injustice would be dealt with. And it is that baby born in Bethlehem that shapes Nicholas and his actions so that he's willing to put his life on the line for the sake of others. Nicholas demonstrates courageous justice, compassionate leadership, and quiet generosity. I think one of the questions for us this Christmas season is, what's Christmas about for us? I think when our church is at its best, it's full of people who are like Nicholas, demonstrating courageous justice, compassionate leadership, and quiet generosity. These coming weeks are going to be full of messages telling you to focus on yourself and your family, telling you to seek the joy that comes from getting your materialistic needs met. Never works. And we know that one of the most complicated times in family life is often Christmas, because everybody has this ideal picture shaped by advertising industries about what should be happening in their family, and no family's perfect. And so often families hit really stressful times at Christmas. So I love the story, the real story of St. Nicholas. I mean, I've grown up, I love Christmas, I still do. But I think we need to take stock and look where materialism has come in and taken us away from the real story. Let's pray. Jesus, thanks that you came to earth and changed everything. Thanks that you do care about compassionate leadership and justice. Thanks that you care about our cities. Thank you for the real Nicholas, who loved you, and because he loved you, loved other people and stood up for what mattered. Help us be inspired by his real story, to look past the tinsel and the trimming and to look to the true story of Christmas. Help us be agents of your grace like Nicholas was. Help us be agents of your justice like Nicholas was. We ask this in your name. Amen.